Happy Monday and good evening. And we begin the readout tonight with what should sound like a familiar story. 12 years ago, in 2010, the pro-Western, pro-reform government of Ukraine was narrowly defeated at the ballot box, ousted by a Kremlin-backed gangster who vowed to never allow his country to join the ranks of NATO. That man was Viktor Yanukovych, a low-key criminal and failed politician who was pushed to power by wealthy oligarchs, Vladimir Putin, and an American political consultant who we've come to know all too well, Paul Manafort. Now, it didn't matter that Yanukovych's party was a haven for mobsters. The key was to replace the pro-Western government in Kyiv with a pro-Kremlin puppet. And Manafort was happy to oblige for a tidy fee. Needless to say, the government under Yanukovych entered a downward spiral of thuggery, corruption, and crackdowns. And Yanukovych's political opponent, Yulia Tymoshenko, well, she was literally locked up after her defeat. It's normal practice, Yanukovych told Time magazine in reference to his jailing of the opposition leader. The party is powerful. The voters support it. When Western countries objected to her arrest, Manafort hired lobbyists in Washington to spin her imprisonment as an example of Ukraine's commitment to the rule of law. As Tymoshenko's daughter explained, their job is to say that white is black and black is white. Now, Manafort's apprentice, Donald Trump, whom he also helped to elect in 2016 with Russia's backing, is acting a lot like that Ukrainian strongman. And he's emerged from his MAGA cocoon as a fully formed authoritarian butterfly. Trump is not only endorsing the thuggery of January 6th, he is now promising to reward the insurrectionists for the violence they committed in his name. Speaking at a rally in Texas this weekend, Trump said that if he retakes the White House in 2024, he may offer them presidential pardons.
Another thing we'll do, and so many people have been asking me about it, if I run and if I win, we will treat those people from January 6th fairly. We will treat them fairly. And if it requires pardons, we will give them pardons.
Behind the scenes, Trump is also planning a massive cover-up of his role in inciting the violence that day, seeking to bolster the baseless conspiracy theory that the FBI did it. According to the Daily Beast, Trump has privately told GOP lawmakers, congressional candidates, and operatives in recent months that Republicans on Capitol Hill should be prepared to launch a full-blown investigation to get to the bottom of how FBI agents supposedly caused violence and mayhem on January 6th. At the same time, Trump is mobilizing his MAGA cult against the law enforcement entities that could stand in the way of another run for president. Here's how he lashed out at New York's Attorney General, Manhattan's District Attorney, and the DA of Fulton County, Georgia, all of whom were investigating him, and all of whom happen to be black.
These prosecutors are vicious, horrible people. They're racists, and they're very sick. They're mentally sick. They're going after me without any protection of my rights by the Supreme Court or most other courts. In reality, they're not after me, they're after you.
Most ominously, Trump summoned his supporters, much like he did before January 6th, to take to the streets in a massive show of force if he's prosecuted.
If these radical, vicious, racist prosecutors do anything wrong or illegal, I hope we are going to have in this country the biggest protest we have ever had in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Atlanta, and elsewhere, because our country and our elections are corrupt.
Separately, Trump also signaled last night that he is no longer even willing to pay lip service to Democratic elections. He's now attacking the Republican lawmakers who are seeking to reform the Electoral Count Act of 1887, so there's zero ambiguity about the vice president's power, or lack thereof, when it comes to certifying the votes of the Electoral College. But that's not what Donald Trump wants his followers to believe. He is claiming that efforts to reform the law, which, by the way, are no substitute for federal reforms that reverse these Republican state attacks on the right to vote, that this change to the law is just validation, that Mike Pence did have the right to change the outcome, and that lawmakers are now trying to take that right away. And he whined that Pence could have overturned the election. It actually marks the first time that Trump has dropped his cover story of massive voter fraud and explicitly stated that his goal was indeed to overturn the election that he lost. Joining me now is Jason Johnson, professor of journalism and politics at Morgan State University and host of the Slate podcast, A Word with Jason Johnson. And Masha Gessen, writer for The New Yorker and author of Surviving Autocracy. And Masha, I want to start with you first. I know that you've spent some time in Ukraine. And, you know, I would love for you to sort of tease out for us these ways in which Donald Trump is really sort of emerging. I've sort of described it as emerging from a cocoon as a full authoritarian. I mean, he's hitting all the marks now, threatening, you know, to go after the FBI, investigate them for supposedly being the real attackers on January 6th, and all the rest. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, the project that Donald Trump is following right now, we actually know this not so much from Ukraine or Russia, actually, but from a couple of other Eastern Central European countries where we saw an autocratic attempt. And then during the period when the autocrat was out of office, this building of legitimacy by the future autocrat, right, by attacking the legitimacy of the actually legitimate government, right? It's a very familiar narrative where basically, you know, what we're hearing Donald Trump say is not that the Biden administration is doing something wrong, right? There's no engagement on the issues. It's that it shouldn't exist at all. That the only legitimate administration in this country is the Trump administration, right? Which is why we keep continuing, or he keeps continuing to return to the supposedly fraudulent election, right? And to January 6th, which you would think, right, logically may not be the most beneficial thing for him to return to if you were attacking the administration on the merits. But he's attacking the administration as illegitimate.
And let me play for you, Liz Cheney, you know, and Jason Johnson. I'm going to throw this to you because, you know, the people who don't want him to do this are the normcore Republicans and the, you know, normcore conservative Republicans like Liz Cheney, who would like to see the Republican Party return to something that can go back to, you know, so the Reaganite tax cutting, you know, damn the poor, that kind of thing. She's fine with that, right? It's just this kind of thing. She's not for it. Here she is talking about what Trump said this weekend.
Well, I think certainly the two things, the suggesting that he would provide pardons for the January 6th defendants. And again, we know that a number of those people have been charged with seditious conspiracy. And also the acknowledgement that he was in fact attempting to overturn the election. Those two things really demonstrate what his intention was. They demonstrate what he would do if he were given the chance again.
Your thoughts, Jason?
This is why this doesn't make any sense to me and why there aren't constant alarm bells in the administration. When we have to go to people like Liz Cheney as examples of reasonable people, right? Liz Cheney, who's perfectly happy suppressing votes, who's perfectly happy engaging in lots of other behaviors and policies that I find to be ultimately damning and difficult for democracy, it shows what a dire circumstance we're in. Of course we know what Donald Trump is trying to do. Of course we know what he was attempting to do. Why do we think that the insurrectionists had a plan that was eerily similar to the PowerPoint that the Trump administration was handing around like high school notes when they were preparing to try to take over the government on January 6th? Like, all of these things are known now. So the question isn't, are we moving towards autocracy? The question isn't, oh my gosh, is he becoming more obvious? The question is, who is going to do something about it? I have seen less obvious plans on episodes of Scooby-Doo. Like, it's really clear what they're planning to do in 2024. So the question is, what can the president do? What will the president do? What will Merrick Garland do? Because they're going to keep talking about their plans and dropping little breadcrumbs about what they're doing. But if we don't do anything about it, we will only have ourselves to blame if this democracy falls.
Well, their breadcrumbs are actually full sandwiches at this point. Here's Newt Gingrich, you know, saying the quiet part, like screaming the quiet part. Here he is.
And I think when you have a Republican Congress, this is all going to come crashing down, and the wolves are going to find out that they're now sheep, and they're the ones who are, in fact, going to, I think, face a real risk of jail for the kind of laws they're breaking.
I'm going to follow that with a Republican candidate for the Michigan State Senate who told a crowd that people should show up with guns to protect Republican election observers. Here is that candidate.
Are you armed? I say in all seriousness, the Second Amendment isn't there for hunting rights. It's not there for self-defense. The Second Amendment is there. The founders put it there to protect all the others. So if you ask, what can we do? Show them arm.
So in addition to a candidate for Michigan State Senate saying a crowd should show up armed to monitor the counting of ballots, or to protect election observers who are so-called monitoring the counting of ballots, Yahoo News did a poll and asked, would Republicans vote for a candidate who admits that Joe Biden won the 2020 election? Only 57% said they would not vote for a candidate who would admit that Joe Biden is the legitimate president. So, Masha, I think Jason asked a good question. In the case where we are sort of mired in a very obvious authoritarian, sort of freak show, what ought the administration, the Justice Department, what can they do about it at this point?
That's a great question. I think that there have to be efforts to restore the legitimacy of this administration, right? And it has to be an all-encompassing project. It has to be a project that includes creating a kind of national narrative, which includes both what happened on January 6th, which I don't think the administration has done a great job of. It's really, it's stepped away from telling that story, right? Trying to find some kind of middle between prosecuting the insurrectionists and letting sort of the process take care of itself, and in this very American way, just moving on and letting bygones be bygones, which is the absolute worst thing you can do, because there's nothing bygone about this, right? I mean, what we're watching is a huge part of the country that really sincerely believes that the election was stolen. And if you consider that for a second, you realize that showing up with guns to election counting is not an unreasonable thing to do in that framework, right? Imagine you really believe that your democracy was stolen from you. What are you going to do about it is a question that they're asking themselves in exactly the same way that we're asking ourselves, right? And so it has to be a huge national effort, and that's the one thing that we're not observing.
We're seeing, Jason, that it does appear that in some ways the administration is counting on the January 6th committee to tell that narrative. We know former Chief of Staff Mark Short is now testified in front of the committee. People are testifying. Is it good enough for the January 6th committee to eventually put that narrative forward if the administration isn't doing it?
I haven't seen a committee fundamentally change anything in American politics over the last 10 years outside of what happened with the gentleman who just got on the Supreme Court. For some reason, his name has escaped me right now. At the end of the day, the committee is not going to be enough. It's not. It's not. If you don't start seeing people suffer consequences, if you don't start seeing people go to jail, then the committee is not going to be enough. If Merrick Garland isn't sending people on perp walks, then the committee is not going to be enough. And this is the thing. And Joy, I want everybody to understand this, because sometimes I'm called cynical or being unfair or putting the blame on the wrong people. We're at a point now where the House is burning, okay? The House, democracy, it is burning. Now, we can argue about who set it on fire. We know the Republicans set it on fire. But at this point, this administration is sitting there with a fire hose going back and forth on who's going to turn it on. It doesn't matter how the House started burning. We got to stop the fire at this point. And so, to me, I don't think that a committee is going to be enough. I don't think this is beyond narratives at this point, Joy. This is the fact that we've got in Arizona, we've talked about several states, Arizona right now passed new laws that basically are going to allow the Republican legislature to discount any votes that they don't like. We're beyond the point of just having no drop boxes. We're literally getting to the point where legislatures are going to say, if we don't like the results, your votes don't matter.
Yeah, and Masha, last question here. You just come back from Ukraine. How seriously do you think we are at risk of what happened to Ukraine morphing into war with Russia, or a war between Ukraine and Russia, or something even bigger with NATO involved?
Right. Well, we're not going to know until we know. The president of Ukraine is very much trying to sort of spread calm, to say there's nothing that we're seeing now that we haven't been seeing for the last 8 years. And he has a very strong point, right? He's trying to remind the world that Ukraine has, in fact, been at war with Russia, or rather, Russia has been at war with Ukraine for the last 8 years. The threat to Ukraine is ongoing. What's important about this also is that Vladimir Putin sees himself as being at war with the United States. Ukraine is irrelevant to his view of what's happening and the game that he's playing. That's the incredibly tragic thing about being in Ukraine, because the fate of Ukraine, this country of 44 million people who fought so hard for their democracy, is being decided by the big players. And there's no, the Ukrainians keep saying no discussing Ukraine without Ukraine, but that's exactly what's happening.
It's happening.
And Ukraine is not going to have a role in deciding whether there's a war.
It's a tragic situation, but it's also a cautionary tale. And I think that's why we stay on this story, because we need to understand we could be Ukraine. Any country can go in that direction. No country is that special or unique. Masha Gessen, always great to talk with you. Jason Johnson, my friend, thank you very much. Always appreciate you both.